So we have here Professor Roy Green from the UTS School of Business, the Dean of School of Business. Thank you for joining us, Professor Green.
Pleasure.
And so the topic of today is leadership. Leadership specifically in Australia, and the gaps in leadership in Australia, and what we can do to bridge that gap and improve Australia's leadership capacity, both at the academic level, but also within the industry. So, Professor Green, what are your thoughts on the level of leadership and in today's society, mainly in Australia?
Well, I think historically in Australia we've had some great leaders, political leaders, business leaders, union leaders, who have taken the society forward at key points in its history. We could start by naming them, but it would probably take more than the allocated time. But even in the current era, we have some very significant business leaders around the world, not only in Australia. We have Andrew Liveris, a Darwin boy who has now risen to being CEO of Dow Chemical in Detroit. We have Jack Nasser, who became the CEO of Ford. We have a number of key business figures in international companies around the world. Those also who have been involved in entrepreneurship and startup activity. Young people like Scott Farquhar and Michael Cannon Brooks in Atlassian. There is no end, of course, to the ingenuity and the potential for leadership among Australians. We're a very fortunate country. We have a good education system. We prepare people reasonably well. And so it's not surprising that we have a larger share, perhaps, of leaders. Even in the founding of the United Nations, Doc Evatt and other Australians played a very major global role. The usual way of saying this is that we punch above our weight. But then we also have to bear in mind that it's not entirely a favourable story. And we also have evidence that despite these very significant leaders and events, we also have a real problem with what we might call, and we did call in a recent study of management and leadership in Australia, a long tail of mediocrity. Tail, T-A-I-L, you could say T-A-L-E as well. But this was a global study that we were commissioned to do by the federal government with the London School of Economics and also Stanford University at a later stage. And that took in first 15 countries, then 20 countries around the world, looking at management caliber and its relationship to productivity. And what it found was that Australian managers overall, and this is mainly looking at SMEs in manufacturing, were not the worst in the world, and we wouldn't expect that they were, but they're not the best either. And when we look at the statistical evidence, not just a handful of people that have done well, but the whole cohort, we find across, it's around 7,000 observations among those countries, that Australia is in the second tier of leadership. Now we can get away with that and have done for many years, firstly behind tariff walls when we were somewhat insulated from international competition. But we can't get away with it now. We're exposed to international competition, and even more sharply because of the high dollar. We are a high cost economy, and what we're seeing at the moment is that the top is coming off the terms of trade boom, at which the prices other countries are prepared to pay for our raw materials has begun to diminish, and that means that we have to make up for the national income lost with other sources of national income, and that's mainly productivity. Now normally what would happen, and what happened on previous occasions when the terms of trade dropped, such as the mid-1980s, we also saw a drop in the dollar, which helped our competitiveness internationally, and we saw the rise of some very strong manufacturing enterprises at that time. but now what we face is a decline in our terms of trade and a high dollar simultaneously, because the Swiss and the Russian central banks think we're a safe haven currency, and that means the dollar is going to stay high. That puts even more pressure on our exporters and more pressure to improve our productivity. Now, what if we have poor management? Well, the connection between poor management and productivity was very evident in our study, and the area where we fell down most in our management, among the 18 characteristics measured across operations management, performance management and people management, was in this area of people management. Now, I know a lot of the people watching this will be from engineering backgrounds, it's not your area that is primarily at fault here. You'll be pleased to know operations management we do quite well, but if we're not managing the technology successfully and we're not making the best use of our people in that context, then all of the effort that you put into the application of technologies in our companies will be futile. So the area where we fell down most and where we dropped most behind world best practice out of the 18 characteristics is titled Instilling a Talent Mindset. So that, you might say, is a proxy for the innovative capability of our companies and our workforces, and the ability of managers to draw that out. If that's the area where we're weakest, then we do have some problems with management and leadership in Australia, and that's where we really need to put our focus if we're to develop our innovation potential, which in turn flows into our productivity performance. And our innovation potential, as many of the studies in this area have shown, are not just about science and technology, it's about non-technological forms of innovation as well, particularly new business models, systems integration, and high-performance work and management practices.
And do you see this issue across SMEs as well as large organizations within Australia, or is it something which is more seen in the SMEs? Or?
Well, particularly the SMEs. There is a size factor here. The larger companies do quite well in our survey, as they do in other countries. There's a kind of uniform level of quality among the leaders and managers of large international companies, and that's not surprising because many of them are trained in the same way. They're very mobile. The recruitment practices and promotion practices are pretty standard and regular across companies and countries. But when we drill down into the SME sector, we find family companies with no professional structure, unlike in Germany or Sweden or parts of the US, where SMEs and particularly family companies are highly professionalized. In the German Mittelstand, the manufacturing sector of SMEs in Germany, there's a very meritocratic, very highly structured approach to SMEs and family companies. Here, it's a lot more haphazard. Sentiment plays a role, patriarchy plays a role. There's much less room for structure in those informal arrangements, and part of that comes back to the way in which we train our managers. And so another factor in the long tail of mediocrity, the tail of poor management performance in our SMEs, a lot of that stems from a low level of training and education in our management class. We, on this table of a number of countries, come near the bottom when it comes to the proportion of managers with formal tertiary qualifications. And I don't just mean business qualifications, any kind of qualifications at all. There's a very close relationship between those level of qualifications and the management capability and productivity performance of those companies, which is not to say that we can't find managers and companies that perform well with low levels of tertiary qualifications, but they're the exception rather than the rule. We'll always see a leader who stands up and says, look, I got here even without any qualifications, I just learnt on the job. Well, they do exist, but they are the exception rather than the rule.
And do you think there are certain traits that leaders have that, you know, it could be that that there are leaders which haven't had formal qualifications, but they tend to be quite good leaders and be able to manage their team quite effectively. Are there certain traits that they have that help them to perform well?
Absolutely. People have certain traits that will align well with the requirements and the strategic direction of their organisations. That might be accidental rather than by design, which is why the management education system is important in ensuring that those elements are designed in the capability agenda of the emerging group of managers and leaders in Australia. But those traits are essentially to understand the future of the company, to be able to analyse its strengths and weaknesses, to be able to engage with the workforce and with the company and its customers and the wider community generally about the strategic direction and the markets that it wishes to occupy. It's also about authenticity and the ability of the manager to not only communicate but to gain resonance among a workforce that enable that company to be more than the sum of its parts. Management and leadership has been very carefully analysed over the years by academics and by pundits and journalists, and there are certain characteristics of managers that really stand out when you find that they have been successful, especially at times of adversity. It's very easy to be a good manager when everything is going well and things are ticking over, but you certainly see the test when it comes at a time of adversity for the company with a shrinking market, when it needs to reinvent itself, when it needs to take a different course. And in those contexts, new ideas around design innovation and design thinking are becoming quite prominent. Obviously, business analytics is much more important than it used to be with the wealth of information that we now have out there. How do we analyse that information? But also more intuitive concepts, the qualitative aspects of management as well as its quantitative aspects are also important. And design thinking is about imagining where your company might be. If you think in terms of a blank page, in the future, where is its market? This is the way Steve Jobs at Apple thought, for example. He didn't go out and do a market survey as to whether everyone wanted an iPod. He produced the iPod and then he measured the market response and adjusted the design and the functionality accordingly. And that's how a true leader emerges, that there is a strong intuitive element about where they want to take their organisation, but then they back that up with quantitative analysis and very, very good engineering. That's why when we hear and read management theorists like Peter Drucker, the great management theorist of the 20th century, say that, well, management is essentially about technology and markets, we have to now adapt that to the 21st century, and I would adapt it by saying, well, in the 21st century, the corporation is a combination of business analytics and design thinking. If you get those together, then you have a company that has a high likelihood of success.
Exactly. And going back to what you mentioned earlier, that when things are going well, when it's easier to manage things, but when things are going down, like, people kind of lose, I guess they lose themselves, and that's where I guess the concept of self-leadership, or being able to self-manage oneself, one's emotions and one's ups and downs, and so you're not reacting emotionally to every situation. And I think that's a key element also if you may agree that that must
Yes.
also be taken into
No,
account.
well, that's an extremely good point. We brought out here the Australian Business Deans Council, which is all the deans of all the business schools around Australia, 40 business schools. We brought out, as part of our Future of Management Education project, a year and a half or so ago, Harvard Professor Srikant Datta, who had just completed his book Rethinking the MBA, because the MBA is often blamed for the problems that have befallen the world economy in the early 2000s with the global financial crisis. How could these Harvard graduates get it so wrong in the financial sector? How could this speculative bubble have arisen? How could we not have foreseen it? And also, why has it taken so long to reconstruct our economy and reconstruct the way we train our managers and leaders? So he wrote a book about this, drawing on a lot of evidence from US business schools in the main, and he argued that the future of business schools should be around teaching three areas: knowing, doing, and being. Simple as that. Knowing, obviously, being the academic and conceptual basis to management and what we have to take out into the real world. And there's plenty of management theory around that is valuable, and we need to rescue it, sometimes from those who use it in the wrong way, developing all of these financial derivatives that have ruined the lives of many hundreds of thousands, millions of people. And secondly, doing. How do we translate those concepts into practical action? How do we make our business courses more practical? The example is often given of medical clinicians in medical schools. Why don't we have business schools more like medical schools, where we have people practicing before they go out and do it? And here at UTS, for example, we've developed what we call the U-Lab, which is an experiential lab where the students can try out new ideas, entrepreneurial ideas, new ventures, startups, and also business consulting with companies, and just creative exercises to make themselves more employable. So that's doing. And then being, and that gets to your point of self-reflection, self-knowledge. Who am I? How do I behave ethically? How do I take responsibility for my decisions? How do I relate to other people? All of those issues, which might have been seen as a bit fluffy and superfluous to business education, are now right at the centre of it. Because if we had more reflective people who understood the effect of their actions, maybe a lot of these activities and really fraudulent behaviour that occurred during and before the global financial crisis may not have occurred.
Yes, and I think it's probably where a good leader may need to start is, who am I, what do I stand for, what is my purpose here, what am I trying to achieve? And coming from within rather than externally. And unfortunately, I think a lot of the leaders that you mentioned have come from the external view of, okay, how can we get more out of little? Compromising human relationships, ethics, and so on. And I think one of the main aspects of probably leadership education would be self-knowledge and being able to understand what is mean to be human.
That's right.
And the ethical and the social responsibilities of being a human and the social responsibilities.
Yes, well, you see, education goes far beyond technical competence. And the deans in Sydney were given a lesson in that, in fact. About a year or so ago, we were asked into the headquarters of one of Australia's leading banks. I won't say which one, but it's a bank that is in fact reinventing itself. And it brought in the Sydney business deans because it wanted to show them something about their new approach. And we all entered the room, which set up with tea and coffee. It all looked very nice, but what was lying behind it was a bit of an ambush, because when we walked in, what we saw were the key executive managers of this bank brought together especially for this occasion. So extraordinarily high-powered meeting. The manager of wealth, the manager of retail, etc. And as we sat down, we realised first three things. Firstly, they were all much younger than we were. Secondly, and even more interestingly, they were mainly not from Australia. They were from around the world, from Canada, from India, from South Africa. These were the managers of an Australian bank, which somehow, before we'd really realised it, had become very globalised. And thirdly, and most astoundingly of all, certainly to some of my colleagues, we were quite pleased at UTS, mind you, because it was the direction that we wanted to go. Most of the executive managers did not have business degrees. They had degrees in politics, in history, psychology, and that was telling us something as well, that maybe companies are now looking for something else in their emerging leaders. And they made that very clear in the discussion. They said to us that they were very grateful to business schools for producing generations of technically competent graduates, but from now on that was not enough. What we're looking for now, they said, was the next general manager, and that meant a broad understanding of the context of business, a broad understanding of the liberal arts, of a more interdisciplinary approach to business, drawing upon these other sources. And that was certainly quite a revelation, but it's one that is common among many companies, especially global ones around the world now. They are looking for well-rounded graduates who can develop what we might call boundary crossing skills across management, philosophy, engineering,
yes.
psychology, now the Renaissance person, if you like. It's exactly what universities were established to do. And in many ways, because we've become so specialised, we've lost sight of that broader mission. And the important thing in the future will be to, especially for leaders, to develop those boundary crossing skills, communication, of problem solving, of critical thinking, collaboration, as well as the body of specialised domain knowledge from which they emerge, what are sometimes called the T-shaped people, with some depth, but also able to think across the boundaries.
And as you mentioned, they say the future lies in the bridging the gap between the humanities and the technical.
Yes.
Technical specializations is kind of understanding what the human needs are, and also bringing those technical knowledge. And in regards to productivity, Australia, recent research has shown Australia is losing at $39 billion a year in lost productivity, and the United States also about $300 billion, which is, of course, it's a larger scale. What could be the main issue? That is it employee engagement? Is it management? Is it a bit of both? What would be causing this?
Yes, well, it's certainly very important for Australia. The US has picked up its game a little bit in terms of its productivity performance, but then it's been able to do so as well. With a low dollar, it's had a lot of opportunity over the last couple of years to improve productivity performance. It's still not as efficient as it could be, but in Australia we've done far worse than most of the rest of the world. Our multi-factor productivity growth went backwards in the early 2000s. Now you could say it's explained by some special factors in particular industries. In the mining industry, for example, there's a lot of investment that's gone in with no consequent output as yet. In the utilities sector, we did a lot of cost cutting in the 1990s, which can't be replicated in the 2000s. We've had a period in which those utility companies have made up for it with a lot of investment, much of it not needed, which is why it's sometimes called gold-plated investment, and that hasn't been matched by output. And similarly in agriculture, we've had droughts and all sorts of reasons why productivity has dropped back. But so that accounts for some of the loss of productivity. But over the longer term, the key factor in our productivity is obviously how our assets are being used, and in particular our human capital. And if we have managers who are not capable of making the best use of their workforces, of their human capital in their organisations, then that's a huge productivity loss to the country. The employers recently surveyed, I think in the Australian Bureau of Statistics, reported that at least half the employers reported that they were not making full use of their employees' skills. And that's only looking at their specialised skills. What about all the opportunities for ingenuity and creativity and a contribution to the future of their organisations in the development of an overall strategic positioning? So many employers just treat employees as the components of their machine, but not with any ability to make a contribution beyond that. Well, of course, those companies which have done very well, especially at the innovative, knowledge-intensive end of the spectrum, have made the best use of the knowledge of their employees. It's such an obvious thing to say, but it's very hard to find workplaces where it's been done successfully. And if one is looking for the biggest drag on productivity in Australia, that's it.
Mm-hmm. And I've heard many of my colleagues that work in the industry, they have some ideas they want to share, but sometimes they're afraid. They think the management might criticize them, and sometimes they think they might lose their jobs. So it shows like the rigidity of management, perhaps, or the strictness or the lack of autonomy and support for creativity and innovation and contribution in that kind of area, going beyond what is the minimum. And so I guess that's probably something to also look at, is how the management can be more able to effectively motivate employees to be more creative, create an innovative environment where there's autonomy for them to kind of be able to embark on a more kind of creative pursuit.
Yes, well, you're talking now about the future of management. That's exactly what is required. Too many of our managers are risk averse. Too many lack the confidence. Too many lack the skills that they can use to engage their workforces in discussion of the future, of new ideas, of what might be seen as distractions from the main game. And employees get the picture pretty clearly. They're paid to keep quiet and keep working. They're not paid to offer ideas because it could expose them to retribution, to marginalisation, or worse. And so there's no culture in Australia, generally speaking, that encourages employees to speak their mind in their companies, to be able to make a much broader contribution than that which they have depicted in their job descriptions. There are companies, of course, that have broken the mould. They're mainly in the technology sector. Companies like Google and Microsoft, they're very interested in drawing on the knowledge of their employees, and they set aside kind of play time when people can go offline and use the company's facilities to develop ideas that may have absolutely nothing to do with their formal job descriptions.
Like 20% time at Google, they can work on it.
And there has been a lot written now about the innovations that have emerged from such offline activities, including the PC itself. So why this hasn't been adopted by more companies is surprising and disappointing, but it can be traced back to a culture of risk aversity by managers. It can be traced back to a feeling that if employees are able to do this, then I, as a manager, have lost control. I don't want to let go of the decisions over which I have control. And so many of these issues ultimately come back to a feeling of insecurity and a desire for control for its own sake, not because it improves the value proposition of the organisation. That's an issue that management education can and should deal with, but it doesn't always do so successfully.
Exactly, and as you mentioned, some of the most successful companies, even Australian companies like Atlassian, they have their one-day FedEx days, they used to call them, where employees can just work on whatever they like outside their main task, and that a lot of innovation came from that.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for all that information. Is there anything else? So how can we actually push Australia forward in terms of leadership, education, and to kind of grow a larger body of work where we can teach more leaders and managers how to be more effective in the organizations, so that their employees can perform better, be more engaged, be more productive, so that Australia can go to the next stage?
Well, I can only use the advice that we were given by the architect of our new business school building that you'll see emerging shortly from the rubble here in Ultimo, Frank Geary, the world-renowned architect. I asked him a few months ago to provide a message for our faculty. If there was a single message he'd like to give us to think about the future of management education, what would it be? And he just wrote back and he said, imagine the future and you will soar. Okay, so he's a poet, he's an artist, but that's effectively what we must say to our next generation leaders. Imagine what the future can be like, and then work out what are the pathways to achieving it. Work out what kind of pathways you can create for your employees if you become a manager to achieve it. Try to supersede the mistakes, the restrictions, the insecurities, the lack of confidence, essentially, of the generation you're replacing. That would be my advice, and everything I see about the emerging generation shows that that is coming to them naturally. They're connected through social media. They have very little time for some of the restrictions that we have had to endure in this generation, and which previous generations had even more severely imposed through Fordist and Taylorist production line mentalities. We've now moved to a much more flexible approach to work, to industry, to our technologies, all of which requires much more knowledge input. And once knowledge is recognized as the source not only of creativity but of wealth, then companies and markets will follow.
Fantastic. Well, that ends our interview. Thank you very much, Professor Green, again.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.